like to draw your attention. Take your seats. We're going to get started. It is really a delight to have this many people show up. How fabulous. He did beautiful posters. He's worked hard on this. I'm Dr. Meg Jordan. He's Department Chair and Professor in Integrative Health. And it's a pleasure to introduce his body of work that he did. Jason did in an independent study this semester on the anthropology of nutrition. And he's going to absolutely take you through a transtemporal time period to his sound and wonderful conclusions that I believe are really designed to enhance your overall health and well-being. He's done beautiful work with us. So Jason, a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Jason Thomas, and like Meg said, I'm in my second year here in a master's program of integrative health studies. And this presentation tonight is covering the independent study that I took, which covers the history of the human diet. So I'd like to thank everybody here for coming out, and I'd also like to thank Meg for giving me the opportunity to study this and really run with it the way that I wanted to. So tonight I'm going to take you through a quick history of the human diet. It's going to be very quick because this room is actually booked at 7:30, so I'm going to go very quickly. And I was hoping that I would have time at the end to take questions. That probably won't be possible, but maybe one-on-one, if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. There was going to be a PowerPoint, but the good news is nobody likes a PowerPoint anyway. It's not going to happen tonight. It was mostly just pictures anyway. So I've always been interested in nutrition from a very early age, and in my questions about nutrition, a lot of other questions have also come up, such as what did people do before the advent of toothpaste and toothbrushes and floss? People's teeth must have just been a horrible mess, full of cavities and gum disease and gingivitis. They didn't have any orthodontists back then, so when the wisdom teeth came in, they must have crowded out all the other teeth. They must have been crooked. They had to have been horrible, right? Well, it turns out that back in the early 20th century, there was a dentist by the name of Weston Price who saw that in his patients there were more and more cavities, and he had the hunch that this had to do with the diet that they were eating, full of refined sugar, refined flours, and additives and preservatives. So he went around throughout the entire decade of the 1930s and looked at many different indigenous populations living their traditional lifestyles. He went to almost every continent, and what he found was that those societies which were eating their traditional diets did not have cavities, they did not have extensive dental decay, and they were also strong and healthy. And those same people from those populations who had come into contact with the Western diet had cavities, bad teeth, they had poorly formed dental arches, and they didn't have room in their face for the wisdom teeth to come in. So this discovery was really fascinating for me, and it led me to want to study more about our ancestral diets. So where do we begin when we study an ancestral diet? Well, we can take it back to 200,000 years ago. That's what I have on the whiteboard over there. In 200,000 years, we mark that time because at this point, pretty much all anthropologists and evolutionary biologists can agree that we had modern, fully formed Homo sapiens on the planet. But really, we could go back, and I could draw that timeline across the board here, across the room, through that door, and I could just keep going with it, because really, where do we start when we want to start with the history of the human diet? At 200,000 years ago, we were all living in Africa, and it was 150,000 years ago when we actually left for the first time, but that group died out about 95,000 years ago, and about 95 days ago, about 85,000 years ago, it was when a second group left Africa. They crossed the Sahara, which at that time was a very green, lush valley. They made it into the Levant, and from there they spread out along the coast of southern India into southern China. And by 75,000 years ago, we were into New Guinea and Australia. By 45,000 years ago, the climate had warmed again, and we were into Northern Europe. By 25,000 years ago, we hit North America, and by 15,000 years ago, we were into South America, so we were all over the world. But taking it back all the way to 6 million years ago, Africa was a very hot place. We were eating mostly fruits, like I had said. And as the climate started to cool and this new landscape came into being, we had to switch our diet to a much lower quality diet. Now, I'm sure you're wondering at this point, how is he going to tell us what we've been eating for millions of years with no historical record? There is no written record from back then. There's certainly no YouTube videos. But it turns out that there are many different sources that we can use that if we put them all together, we can come up with a pretty reliable view of what we've been eating throughout history. One of these is the paleontological evidence. This includes fossils, skeletons, importantly the teeth. We can look at non-human primates and the similarities and the differences between us and them, such as gut size, body composition, and cephalization. We can also look at the remaining hunter-gatherers and the ones that lived at least up until the early 20th century. And we can also look at stable isotope analysis, which gives us a ratio of how much plant versus animal food has been eaten. So back 6 million years ago, as the climate started to cool and we had to broaden our diet, one of the things that we did that was a very new addition is we took on underground storage organs as the main form of calories. Underground storage organs are things like the ancestors of the yam, or the sweet potato, the turnip, the carrot, things like that. And we also had to take in more leaves and stems, all in all a lower quality diet, and that changed our teeth. Specifically, it changed our molars. Our molars got much larger because we were chewing all these hard to process foods. Now you take that up a few million years, up to about 2.5 million years ago, and at this point we began to incorporate meat into our diet. We know that we were doing this because we had stone tools at that point, and we can look at bones, and we can look at the cut marks on bones, and the cut marks from stone tools are very different from the cut marks from teeth. By a couple million years ago, there was a larger climatic shift, and East Africa was becoming even more arid. More grasslands were replacing those forested areas, and that also led to a new landscape of animals. We had much larger mammals, both carnivore and herbivore. Now, when we talk about our meat consumption, it was really more of a quest for fat than it was for meat. In fact, even up to this day, there are some modern hunter-gatherers who eat up to 60% of their diet just as fat. And throughout all this time, from 6 million years ago, all the way up till now, humans have been consistently selecting a diet lower in fiber. With the increase in meat that we were eating, our teeth changed again. They began to get smaller. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions about teeth, and people think if we were eating meat, shouldn't we have these huge, gigantic, canine-type teeth? But remember, we weren't taking down prey with our teeth, and we weren't ripping meat off the bones with our teeth. We were using stone tools, which we were able to process this food into small, bite-sized pieces. Also, we think about hunting and gathering, and we think that we were doing a lot of hunting, but there was also a way that we got meat and fat, and it's called confrontational scavenging. And confrontational scavenging is just what you think it is. And the debate about how much were we getting through hunting and how much were we getting through confrontational scavenging is still a debate that we're having, but the point is we were getting meat from both sources. Our earliest hunting methods mostly involved mass kill episodes where we were driving herds of animals off cliffs. Now, plants at this time, we were still eating a lot of underground storage organs, but those stopped being our main source of calories sometime well after 2 million years after we had taken on a lot more meat and fat in our diet. You see, before cooking, animals were very hard to catch, but they were easy to eat. There's really no processing. We were eating a lot of innards, a lot of marrow, brain. Plants, on the other hand, plants are easy to catch, but they're harder to eat. They require, in many cases, multi-step processing. For example, you need to grind or pound or ferment them. You need to change them from one state to another, from a solid to a mush or to a dough. And the question is, did we have the modern cognition millions of years ago to be able to carry out all of these multi-step processing? It was around this point 2 million years ago when Homo erectus emerged. And there was a large increase in brain size as compared to body size. Now, we paid for that brain increase by decreasing the size of our guts. Our guts, the human gut, is dominated by the small intestine, and we have relatively small colons. The great apes, on the other hand, they have a relatively modest small intestine, and they have very large colons for all of the difficult to digest plant matter that they're eating. This is opposite the human gut. If we look at studies on the surface area of gut segments in humans, those studies always place us closer to the carnivore/frugivore line than they do the herbivore line. Now, cooking changed everything. One of the big things that cooking changed was mastication, chewing. If we lived like the great apes do, we would spend about 50% of our day chewing. Cooking makes this about 10%. One example of this is if you take 3 pounds of carrots and boil them for 15 minutes, you can reduce chewing time by 80%. Cooking also improves digestibility. It converts complex carbs into more easily digestible forms. We spend less energy on digestion and we spend more energy on growth. Cooking also helped our transitions into a lower fiber diet, and they also helped along these changes in the gut size and changes in the tooth size. So when did cooking start? Richard Wrangham, an anthropologist, puts it at about 2 million years ago, although that date is very hard to back up. There's very scant evidence for cooking that long ago. But nearly everyone can agree that cooking was around basically everywhere, anywhere from 250,000 years ago to 400,000 years ago, well before our timeline starts here. Our hunting methods were also improving. We had developed wooden spears by 400,000 years ago, and by the time our timeline starts here, we had developed stone-tipped spears, and we were taking down animals which are labeled megafauna. These are things like the woolly rhinoceros, the woolly mammoth, the giant deer, the steppe bison, or the auroch, which is the ancestor of the modern cow today. So from 200,000 years ago up to about 45,000 years ago, we were eating a lot of meat and fat from megafauna, rounded off with a wide variety of plant food, mostly underground storage organs, although at this time we were literally eating hundreds of different varieties of plants. Another way that we know about this is through stable isotope analysis. Stable isotopes are simply the isotopes of an element that do not break down over time. As we eat, we incorporate these stable isotopes into our bodies, into our bones and collagen and teeth. And we can use both carbon and nitrogen isotopes to see what ratio of plant food we got versus the ratio of animal food. And all studies that we do throughout this time show that we were getting nearly all of our protein sourced through terrestrial land animals. Our innovation in hunting techniques continue to improve, and by 50,000 years ago, every human population on Earth had the knowledge of projectile weaponry. One example of this is the spear thrower. A spear thrower is a device that just extends the length of your arm, and you're able to put a spear into it and throw it longer. You can check these videos out on YouTube of modern people throwing spears with spear throwers. It's pretty neat. We used to take down this megafauna with these spear throwers. Now around this time, 50,000 years ago, the high-ranked, high-returned resources started to deplete. And whether this is due to our increased hunting abilities or for other reasons, the fact is that these steppe bison and the woolly mammoths, the woolly rhinoceroses, they started to disappear. And a new landscape of animals took over, animals such as the deer, the gazelle, and the boar, and we started to incorporate these smaller mammals, these smaller game into our diets. We also started to incorporate a lot of marine foods into our diets at this time, about 45,000 years ago. And once again, it's stable isotope analysis that points this out. Now, fat was still very important. Anywhere we see kill sites and we find bones, they're always split open looking for the marrow. In fact, we even find hair bones fragmented looking for marrow. And when we say hair, we're talking about the animal hair. We have figured out how to render bone grease by 26,000 years ago. This is simply boiling bones and skimming off the fat that rises to the top. A lot of what we know about this time, we know from looking at modern hunter-gatherers. And there are a lot of misconceptions about modern hunter-gatherers, partly from history. For example, in 1967, George Murdoch put out what he called the Ethnographic Atlas. He studied about 229 traditional societies, and he tried to figure out what were they eating and what was their diet made up of. He did his best, but he did make some mistakes. He tried to estimate, he made his food estimates by weight instead of by energy content. Now, if you're only getting 15% of your daily calories through underground storage organs, already by weight, you're going to have more plant food than you are animal food. Another thing that he did is he made up all these categories. He divided it into gathering, hunting, fishing, animal husbandry, and agriculture. But in the gathering section, he included collecting small land fauna, such as insects, small mammals, reptiles, and shellfish. So when you look back in that data and you say, were we hunters or were we gatherers? Then you say, oh, we did an awful lot of gathering. But you have to dig down into that to realize most of what we were gathering was animal product. His conclusion is that we ate a diet about 35% animal food and 65% plant food. But in modern studies looking at that data again, we realize it's probably quite the opposite. We've probably traditionally eaten about 65% animal food and 35% plant food. In fact, of all the hunter-gatherers that he studied, almost all of them ate over 50% of their food as animal product. Only 14% of the places he studied ate over 50 as plant product. And we kept saying animal product, not just meat, because this included insects. Insects such as larvae from wasps, ants, cranes, moths. We also ate the actual insects themselves, such as cicadas, stink bugs, cockroaches. In fact, a lot of people still do eat insects. Indigenous hunter-gatherer tribes have been witnessed eating nothing but insects for up to 28 days straight. So when we talk about how we were eating 65% of our diet as animal product and 35% as plant product, this creates in our mind an image of a dinner plate that is just stacked up with steaks and pork chops and chicken and just a couple little pieces of asparagus to round that off. But remember what we said about if you're just eating 15% of your diet through underground storage organs, you're already more by weight. So if you're eating closer to 35%, or even more, if you're edging up to towards 50%, by volume or by weight, you're going to have much more plant product than you are animal product. And this is where a lot of confusion comes in. We want to measure food by energy content, not by weight or by volume. But if we do by weight or volume, we are eating mostly plants. So Staffan Lindberg, he's an anthropologist who did the Catawba studies out in New Guinea. He concluded that the foods available to our ancestors were meat, fish, shellfish, vegetables, fruits, nuts, insects, and roots. So what's crucial to consider as we move forward is, as Boyd Eaton and Melvin Connor, two very prominent anthropologists, state, the human genetic constitution has changed relatively little in the past 40,000 years. And as Wrangham says, the human anatomy has seen relatively little change over the past 2 million years since the emergence of Homo erectus. So the question we want to ask ourselves as we move forward is, what effect does our modern diet have on our anatomy and our genetic constitution, which have remained relatively unchanged for the last tens of thousands of years? Now, I've taken you up to about 12,000 years ago. We've taken through the lower Paleolithic, which is 2.5 million years ago, to 300,000 years ago. We've gone through the middle Paleolithic as well as the upper Paleolithic. And we're now at what we call the rise of agriculture, about 10 to 12,000 years ago. At this point, the climate was warming and grassy plants were flourishing. The glaciers were on retreat. Grassy plants were able to reach maturity and produce seeds before the hot summer weather came. We see by about 10,000 years ago some of the major domesticates appear in Southwest Asia, such as wheat and barley and lentils. We see in Thailand rice come up. Now, a lot of times when we talk about agriculture, we talk about the discovery of agriculture. But we should realize that humans were probably always aware of plant growth patterns. The question is not how was agriculture discovered. The better question is, why was agriculture adopted? And this question becomes more difficult to answer when we look at the effects that agriculture had on human health. Europeans, after the adoption of agriculture, were on average 6 inches shorter than their counterparts of 30,000 years ago. The same thing happened to the Native Americans of the New World, and in fact, the same thing happened in just about every population who took on agriculture as their main food source. You see skeletal manifestations of suboptimal nutrition. Current hunter-gatherers, although they have seasonal food shortages, they rarely have chronic malnutrition or deficiency diseases. Our relatives were tall, they were slender, they had very few cavities, and they had no skeletal evidence of malnutrition or deficiency disorders. A lot of what we think about when we think about the past, we think about this phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. If you've ever heard that phrase before, that comes from Thomas Hobbes back in 1651 from his work Leviathan. But actually, longevity 50,000 years ago, it was common for people to live up to 70 years old. A lot of our life expectancy ratios calculate in child death, infant death, death through childbirth, death from disease, accident, and injury, which have nothing to do with nutrition. Back in 1968, Richard Lee, studying the Coon Bushmen of Africa, found that the percentage of over 60-year-olds was equal to the percentage of over 60-year-olds in the industrialized world. Typical workday of a hunter-gatherer is 3 hours. The Coon that Lee was studying work about 12 to 19 hours a week gathering food. The other portion of their time is spent doing embroidery, visiting other camps, entertaining other visitors, doing things like trance dances at night. So again, the question is, why did we adopt agriculture? It causes more stress, it negatively affects well-being, and there is a general decline in nutrition. Well, for one thing, agriculture can replace instability with stability. and control. With agriculture, we can come up with a surplus, and surplus means an increase in trade. A peasant, an Egyptian peasant about 3,000 years ago was most likely able to reap enough wild grain to get 3 times as much as he needed to feed his entire family. One of the major effects of cultivation is that it devitalizes the soil. And it was about the year 5000 before the Common Era when farmers began to breach the banks of streams and create rudimentary canals and let water flow in. As irrigation methods improved, we got canal systems. And as these canal systems got larger, we needed administrative systems to regulate the resource allocation. These administrative centers turned into towns, towns began to turn into cities, and civilization was born. Now, surplus food, with the diversification of labor, more trade, the idea of land ownership, and dense population centers led to political and military might. We were able to raise large armies. And when you look at large armies, this is a huge advantage when everybody else in the world had the same ingenuity with weaponry. Weaponry was the same throughout the world. So large armies were a huge advantage. And when you combine large armies with the incredible disease resistance that we had from living in these large population centers, as well as living in close proximity to animals which we had domesticated, that is how you got certain cultures overtaking other cultures. For example, the Europeans sailed over and totally annihilated the indigenous people living in the Americas. It was not the other way around because we had the large armies and we had the huge disease resistance. So how did diet remain the same after the adoption of agriculture? Well, we've continued to eat animal product, muscle tissue, fat, offal, even blood. The Arabs drank camel blood with camel hair. The Berbers drank cow's blood mixed with milk. We had the Patnaik tribes drinking horse blood. French peasants were known to have drunk cow blood. The Maasai still drink cow's blood and sheep's blood. We still ate raw food, both plant and animal food. Some of the plants that we were domesticating at that time were the wild ancestors of the turnip, the onions, the radishes, the entire cabbage family. It is a little bit incorrect to assume that dark leafy greens made up a large portion of our diet. They just simply couldn't compete with the animal product and the cereal grains which made up the competition. Until grains made up a large portion of our diet, the plant foods that we were eating were still underground storage organs. Squash is not an underground storage organ, but it was domesticated in Mesoamerica between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago. Manioc was domesticated in South America somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago. And the taro root was domesticated somewhere in Southeast Asia at least 8,000 years ago, maybe earlier. But gradually, new grass seeds began to take up more and more room in the human diet. Things like wheat and rice and rye and millet, sorghum and barley. One of the problems with these grains is that they contain phytic acid or phytates. These are components which bind to minerals in the digestive tract and inhibit their absorption. One way we can remedy this is by soaking grains, and cultures throughout the world have traditionally soaked their grains, and this will remove most but not all of the phytate content. But there are other problems that we can't fix, such as heavy usage of grains depletes the body of vitamin C, and it can also induce vitamin D deficiency. Grains and legumes both contain goitrogens, which are thyroid-inhibiting substances, and of course, a lot of grains contain gluten, which is toxic to intestinal cells. Now, although grains were domesticated and began to be harvested 12,000 years ago, they did not immediately form a large part of our diet. It took time to replace traditional food sources, and remember, even irrigation did not really take off until the year 5000 before the Common Era. Farming techniques had to be honed, and it was not actually until the beginning of the 17th century when the major crops and livestock had become dispersed throughout most of the world. Other new introductions into our foodways after the adoption of agriculture include alcohol. In fact, one of the leading factors suggested in the domestication of grains is the intoxication from beer. Most early cereals were not consumed as bread. They were eaten as either a gruel or a beer. By the Middle Ages, ale was actually the most common drink, even at breakfast. We also incorporated dairy. Now, this was mostly in Northern Europe, but there were a few other spots around the world where it independently arose. The thing about dairy is that dairy contains the milk sugar lactose, and you need the enzyme lactase to be able to break this down. So for those populations up in Northern Europe that needed a large source of calcium and also an available source of calories, anybody who was able to produce lactase into adulthood was able to have a huge advantage over their counterparts and reproduce more. Now, we all produce lactase as infants, and we actually get most of our lactase through mother's milk. But after weaning, generally lactase production tapers off. At that time, most dairy was actually consumed as either sour milk or cheese or yogurt, which has not all that much lactose in the first place. We also incorporated more fermented food into our diet. Now, fermented food was not a new food. We actually used to eat the partially digested stomach contents of our prey. And early forms of fermentation included things like mashing up sweet potatoes, for example, and throwing them in the hole in the ground. But by 2,000 years ago, we see in the historical record references to fermented soy sauce, fermented black bean paste, kimchi, and sauerkraut. That's also a way of preserving food, and food preservation methods took off as well. In our prehistoric past, the only food preservation methods we had were freezing in those climates where it actually got cold enough. We have also been gathering naturally occurring salt for tens of thousands of years. Now, how much we used that salt in food preservation is still debatable, but we did start using the practice of salt winning in the Neolithic era. That's removing salt from seawater. We also figured out how to dry foods. There are references to dried stockfish, people eating stockfish that are 10 to 12 years old. And those references are usually accompanied with notes about how you have to season that really well because the taste is apparently pretty atrocious. We learned how to smoke foods, and we also learned how to cover foods with a thin layer of fat to exclude air. We also use spices to preserve food. Spices are simply the dry parts of a plant that impart flavor. The most widely used spice today is the chili family, and that was domesticated by the Aztecs 5,000 years ago. We see in many places of the world spice grinding stones in use 4,000 years ago. Spices play a huge role in our history. By the mid-1500s, there were over 1 million pounds of black pepper being traded over the Mediterranean trade routes. They also became very expensive. In some places, spices were worth more than gemstones. And European countries were beginning to become tired of spending so much money on these spices. They wanted a direct source, they wanted to cut out the middleman, and so they started financing voyages. Think of Vasco da Gama's route to India. Think back to Columbus and what he was after. And after that, you had what they call world discovery. Now, something else that arose not too long ago was the idea of vegetarianism. Now, in a hunter-gatherer society, you are always going to have periods of animal food shortages. But no known primitive culture in the history of the human species has ever adopted vegetarianism by choice. In the ethnographic atlas that we studied, 229 tribes, not a single one was vegetarian. It was about 2,000 years ago when there was the first conscious attempt at vegetarianism. We had the Buddhism and Jainism and the idea of karma, the cycle of rebirth, and they encouraged vegetarianism. It was around the 1st century, before the Common Era, that the Brahmin priests had embraced the anti-slaughter campaign, and by the end of the first millennium of the Common Era, they had crossed the Vindhya Mountains and they had brought the Hindu orthodoxy to the south of India. But remember, no major world religions ever require strict veganism from their followers. The Hindus eat milk and butter and cheese and ghee. The Brahmins eat eggs, poultry, and fish. Now, another big change in our diet that has happened recently is our change in food preparation. We are always looking for ways to cut down time spent on food preparation, and there are a couple ways to do this. One is that you can create convenience food that is already processed. One of the first convenience foods was probably what's known as tsampa, which is a grain paste which you could carry ready to go or just add water and mix it around and you could eat that. The Chinese have a lot of references to dried snake, and the Native Americans were known to eat pemmican, which is just a mixture of dried lean meat mixed with rendered fat. The other way to cut down on food prep is to have a third party prepare it for you. The cook shop is first referenced around 634 before the Common Era in the time of Nebuchadnezzar back in Mesopotamia, but traditionally throughout all this time, until very recently, food has always been cooked in the home. And it has always been cooked by somebody either you know or by you yourself. So after the adoption of agriculture, we see that in general we have decreased stature and compromised health. What we also know from the studies that Weston Price did is that he found many traditional societies that had incorporated many of these foods after the adoption of agriculture, and they were still healthy. He studied the Swiss up in the Alps, he studied the Gaelics, and he found that they were soaking their grains, they were eating their grains whole, natural, they were eating raw dairy products from grass-fed animals, and they did not have the excessive dental diseases or the skeletal malformations or the degenerative diseases of Western society. So I've taken you up through time up to about the year 1800. And at the year 1800, this is where I personally draw another line and consider a new era in the history of food. And this era I would call the era of industrialized food. It was in the year 1801 where the first sugar beet factory was built in Poland in a region called Silesia. Now sugar at that time was known, it was consumed, but the thing was sugar was so costly that you couldn't eat very much of it. In fact, in Europe or in England, they used to lock sugar up so that the servants would not steal it. It was that expensive. In that same year in 1801, the average sugar consumption of the average American was 8.4 pounds a year. By a century later, that had risen to 85 pounds a year. And nowadays, depending on what estimates you go by, sugar and caloric sweetener consumption is somewhere between 142 to 160 pounds per year. Fructose consumption has doubled just within the last 30 years. Most of that is due to the increase in high fructose corn syrup, and fructose is the most lipogenic of all the sugars, meaning it's the one most to blame for fat accumulation. Excess sugar consumption has been linked to diabetes, advanced glycation end products, fatty liver disease, some cancers, gout, kidney disease, metabolic syndrome, and more. And keep in mind when I'm talking about sugar here, I'm not talking about the natural occurring sugars in fruits and vegetables, I'm talking about added refined sugar. Another big introduction was in 1793, the cotton gin was invented. And this was a great invention because it was able to separate the cotton fiber from the seed. What happened though is we got all of these seeds as a waste product and we didn't know what to do with them. They were toxic. They couldn't be eaten. But they started to build up. We had more and more of them. And so chemists started playing around with them. And it took them a while, but by the 1870s, they were learning how to use these seeds as fertilizers. By a decade later, they were feeding them to cattle. And by 1899, they had learned to remove the bad odors, remove the toxins, and liquid cooking oils were born. This process has over 20 steps. Some of those steps have names such as bleaching and deodorizing. But nevertheless, we figured out how to do it. The only problem with liquid cooking oils is that they don't work very well for baking things like cookies. For cookies, you need something more like butter or lard, more stable fat. So we learned how to hydrogenate our liquid cooking oils. And this creates a fat that has more saturated fatty acids as opposed to polyunsaturated acids, and it's more stable, so you can use it as shortening. To do this, you need a catalyst. In this case, we use nickel, and we pass hydrogen through the oil, and then we rebleach it, we filtrate it to remove the catalyst, the nickel. In any case, this was invented, it was figured out how to be done, and Crisco went on sale in the year 1910. The big problem with hydrogenated vegetable oils is that they contain trans fats, and trans fats first of all, our body doesn't know how to handle trans fats. These are like fake saturated fats that we've created. Trans fats lower HDL cholesterol, they raise LDL cholesterol, they're involved in increased insulin levels and a whole host of other things. By the year 2005, vegetables made up 23% of the average American diet. And remember, these aren't really vegetable oils, they're seed oils from plants like corn and soy, rapeseed, cottonseed, safflower seed, etc. One of the big problems is that, first of all, there are simply too many polyunsaturated fatty acids now in our diet. But even looking within the polyunsaturated fatty acid category, the ratio of omega-6 fatty acids to omega-3 fatty acids is very skewed. Throughout our past, we used to get that ratio in omega-6, 2 to 4 parts to 1 part omega-3. Nowadays, we get about 20 parts omega-6 to 1 part omega-3. This creates a whole host of problems. One is that it increases total body cholesterol and liver cholesterol. It has been linked to cancer progression and a whole host of other problems. Talking about waste product from seeds, another waste product that we started consuming very recently is soy milk. Soy milk was actually a waste product from the making of tofu. It was this gray, sludgy, very stinky substance, and they didn't know what to do with it, but they had a lot, so they began to play with it. They started to bleach it, took out the odors from it, and they finally learned how to make it palatable, and it went on sale as a health food. It's a very confusing topic because we say, isn't soy a healthy product? It sure is sold as a healthy product. And haven't we been eating soy for a long time? We have, but we've always eaten it as a fermented form. We've eaten it as miso or tempeh or natto. But unfermented soy, including tofu, contains numerous toxins. It contains protease inhibitors, which block the enzymes needed for protein digestion. It contains phytic acid. It contains goitrogen, which inhibit thyroid activity. They also contain phytoestrogens and isoflavones, which mimic estrogen and decrease testosterone in men. Another big addition to the human diet over the last couple hundred years are food additives. Nowadays in the United States, we use over 4,000 food additives in our food diet. These can be broken down into categories such as preservatives, colorings, sweeteners, flavor enhancers, and stimulants. Now, you might think you don't eat a lot of additives, but they're everywhere. Most meat, conventional meat, is passed through an ammonia solution to remove pathogens. Farmed fish have color added to them. Even conventional oranges in the supermarket are oftentimes dyed orange. We've even figured out how to rearrange starch molecules so that they'll pass through the digestive system without being absorbed. And we can legally label these things as fiber. And so when you see food, even whole wheat products that have fiber added, you might wonder, what is this stuff they're calling fiber? Additives are everywhere. If we take a food that you would think isn't too bad off, such as the Subway sweet onion chicken teriyaki sandwich. This is actually marketed as a health food. How many ingredients does that contain? It actually contains 105 ingredients. I want to talk to you about just the ingredients in the chicken. And I'm not talking about the ingredients in the sweet onion sauce or the teriyaki sauce. I'm talking about just the chicken alone. It contains potassium chloride, maltodextrin, autolyzed yeast extract, gum arabic, salt, disodium inosonate, disodium guanylate, fructose, dextrose, thiamine hydrochloride, soy protein concentrate, modified potato starch, and sodium phosphates. That's just in the chicken alone. This list of additives that we have at 4,000 can be bumped up to around 12,000 if we include all of the agents unintentionally in our food supply, such as pesticides and animal drugs. So why are we using so many additives? Well, for one thing, when we preserve foods, it alters the taste, and additives can correct this. Additives can also correct visual appeal, and they can increase shelf lives. Back when foods began to be marketed under brand names, the brand names marketed themselves based on the idea of purity. And to do this, they had to create a new image in the consumer's mind of what pure really meant. But as foods became more and more pure, the idea in the customer's mind changed, and now we demand foods that require the producers to use additives. When you go into the supermarket and you see conventionally grown oranges and you see a stack of beautiful bright orange ones and a stack of dull greenish ones, you're going to choose the orange ones. And so the other folks have to use the orange dye or they're not going to sell their food. And that applies to most all food nowadays. So even the foods that we eat nowadays that we used to eat during the Paleolithic era have changed. Think of meat, for example. Meat used to come from grass-fed animals. Now it comes from grain-fed animals. Ruminant animals are not meant to be eating grain. One of the problems is that it changes their omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid makeup within the actual animal. Grass-fed beef, for example, can have anywhere from 2 to 5 times as much omega-3 than conventionally farmed beef. Our fruits and our vegetables have changed as well. We now douse our fruits and our vegetables in fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. And studies consistently show that conventionally grown fruits and vegetables have lower vitamin and mineral content. Even the foods that we've taken on after the adoption of agriculture have changed. Think of dairy, for example. We used to drink dairy in a raw form. It used to come from grass-fed animals. Now it comes from grain-fed animals, and it's pasteurized and homogenized. Now, pasteurization, that can kill a lot of the harmful bacteria that cause spoilage, but it also kills all the beneficial bacteria. So raw milk or Pasteurized milk does not have the beneficial bacteria that raw milk does. It only has 1/2 to 1/6 of the bioavailable minerals that raw milk does, and it contains less protein. Our grains have also changed quite a bit. Take wheat, for example. Wheat has been hybridized, it's been crossbred, and it's been genetically modified so that increased yield will be attained, and it can also stand harsh environmental conditions. We even have products that are labeled Roundup Ready, so we can spray them with Roundup and kill everything but the actual plant that we want to save. We've created very new strains of wheat, and these strains of wheat, these modern strains of wheat, have much more gluten than the previous strains of wheat, and gluten, remember, is toxic to the intestinal cells. We also refine our grains. The grain comes in 3 parts. It has the outside, which is the bran, has the inside, the endosperm, and it has the very inside, which is the germ. We remove the bran and the germ, where all the vitamins and minerals are, and we just have the starchy endosperm left. Only a handful of grains today, about 8 of them, make up 56% of the food calories eaten today by modern humans. Our food has changed so much that we even have a new category of food called health foods. And this started back in the 1830s. A guy named Sylvester Graham, who was the father of the graham cracker. Nowadays you can buy vitamins and minerals and probiotics and all sorts of pills and powders and tablets and gels. But synthetic vitamins are not the same as real vitamins. First of all, not all the isomers are included. We have molecular byproducts which are included. The absorption is inefficient, and the question remains, what else are actually in these things? One study done over the Women's Health Initiative, which was a study that looked at many different aspects of health, studying regular multivitamin use, they found that it had little or no effect on cancers, stroke, heart attack, or mortality itself. A lot of the foods that we've eaten throughout history, we don't eat anymore. When's the last time you had a blood dinner? Or that you ate insects? Or that you even ate raw meat? Vegetarianism, which you can live a healthy diet on, has now morphed into veganism. It's only modern humans that are able to live a diet that is totally and truly animal-free. Insect eggs, small larvae, and little insect parts are always going to find their way into the food supply. If you've ever grown a garden and you've grown asparagus, you've probably at some point been hit by the asparagus beetle who lays its little eggs all over the asparagus, and you can spend 20 minutes over the sink trying to pick every egg off, but asparagus season goes for a month. And after a while, you're just going to throw it in the boiling pot. It wasn't until industrialization came around and our strict sanitary regulations and our modern food processing methods, which we were actually able to give people a diet truly animal-free. And a vegan diet creates a whole host of problems. The major one is a vitamin B12 deficiency. We've even changed how we feed our infants and our babies. Now, bottle feeding is not something that's new. It's mentioned in classical Greek and Roman times, but it was very uncommon until after World War II. Commercial infant formula, it can provide some of the nutritional needs for a baby, but it provides none of the immunological needs for the baby. Another way in which we've changed how we feed our children is through pre-mastication. Pre-mastication is simply chewing up food, spitting it out, and giving it to the child. Pre-mastication has been practiced on all continents in all societies until very recently. Saliva contains substances which factor into the promotion of oral health and swallowing and pre-digestion, and it facilitates the absorption of food. The boost that pre-mastication gives to the immunological system is so great that our ancestors would never have survived up till now without it. Yet today, if you are caught in a restaurant chewing up food, spitting it out and giving it to your baby, you'll probably get child services called on you for child abuse. So, with all these food changers, the basic building blocks that we use to build our bodies, the nutrients that we take in, have changed quite a bit. Melvin Connor and Boyd Eaton make some estimates over nutrient intakes in our Paleolithic ancestors, and we can compare their estimates to the Center for Disease Control estimates of the modern American intake, and I just want to go over 3 different nutrients here. One is potassium. We used to get, on average, about 7,000 milligrams per day. Nowadays, the average American gets 1,328 milligrams per day. Fiber, we used to eat about at least 70 grams per day. Now remember, we have constantly been selecting for a diet lower in fiber throughout history. Nowadays, we've gotten it all the way down to 10 to 20 grams, which is a big difference. Cholesterol, we used to get over 500 milligrams per day of cholesterol. Now we only get about 225 to 307 milligrams per day of cholesterol, much of that due to the misguided war against cholesterol. So diets all across the world now are becoming similar. The first phase in this is the increased consumption of sugar and vegetable oils. Next come ultra-processed foods. A journalist by the name of Melanie Warner estimates that about 70% of caloric intake in modern humans come from ultra-processed foods. Not only what we eat, but how we eat has changed. We used to eat together as families in the proverbial cave. Now we eat alone. We eat a lot of time in cars. Studies have shown that being relaxed and laughing while you eat cause lower spikes in blood sugar and improve digestion. But nowadays we eat very distracted. We have TVs, internet, phones, all in use. Food is being microwaved nowadays instead of slow cooked, which can kill 97% of the phytonutrients. When we think about all these changes, and we think about what Staffan Lindberg said about the foods available to our ancestors, being comprised of meat, fish, shellfish, vegetables, fruits, insects, nuts, and seeds. And we look at today's modern diet and we say that 17% of the average American diet caloric intake comes through sugar, 23% comes through vegetable oils, grains make up most of the rest, 70% of our food is ultra-processed. We have to wonder, what does that do to our health? Now, a long time ago, people used to die oftentimes from accidents and injuries. Diseases that people used to get even after the rise of agriculture, which a lot of these diseases were linked to our close proximity with animals. We got things like tetanus, rabies, malaria, and yellow fever. We got typhoid fever and smallpox and diphtheria, many of which we've cured today, none of which have to do anything with nutrition. Nowadays we get diseases such as coronary heart disease, stroke, atherosclerosis, type 2 diabetes, overweight and obesity, insulin resistance, hypertension, dyslipidemia, cancer, osteoporosis, dementia, and the list goes on and on and on. These diseases are what we call modern diseases. They call them diseases of civilization or Western diseases. The thing about these diseases is that if you look at modern hunter-gatherer tribes, or if you look into the historical record, you'll find that these diseases were either extremely rare or they were entirely absent. So I've noticed a big trend nowadays when somebody writes a book or they give a presentation and the subject is somewhat heavy, that they always end it with a few chapters of the solution. Well, here's what we do. It's all right. So you're probably wondering, what is the solution? Are we supposed to go back to our ancestral diet? Well, first of all, we can't. Remember, we killed all the woolly mammoths and the woolly rhinoceroses and the giant steppe bison and the giant deer and the aurochs. Also, the plant foods are not the same. We've domesticated them and bred them into today's varieties. Also, there wasn't just one Paleolithic diet. There were humans all over the globe, and we were eating a very wide range of foods, so you can't just pick one Paleolithic diet. Also, there are many foods that we eat nowadays that we've incorporated into our diets that are perfectly fine and good. Fermented foods, for example, increase healthy gut bacteria. Even grains and dairy, if prepared correctly, if eaten in a whole form, if soaked correctly, if eaten wheat strains that are not the modern ones, the old ones without much gluten in them, can be incorporated into your diet and you can be healthy. So I don't have solutions for you tonight. This presentation is about the history of the human diet, not solutions to the human diet. But I do want to let you, I want to give you a couple questions to ask yourselves when you choose food. One is, ask yourself, is this normal? Is the sweet onion chicken teriyaki sandwich, is that normal food? Is that human food? Is it normal to eat this much sugar? And if you compare yourself to modern sugar consumption of up to 160 pounds, you might think you're not doing so bad. But compare that to the year 1801 when we were only getting 8.4 pounds of sugar, maybe it's not so good. Maybe even 8.4 pounds of sugar compared to what our ancestors was getting is a pretty shocking amount. Another question you can ask yourself is, did you prepare it? Because the truth is, if you didn't prepare your food, you really don't know what's in it. And up until only the recent past, food has always been prepared by us or by somebody we know. And nowadays, if you go out to eat, you can ask what's in the food, but the people giving it to you, they don't know. because they buy their food from distributors and manufacturers. So I'd like to wrap this up tonight by talking about Leo Tolstoy. If Tolstoy had studied nutritional anthropology, I think that he might have started one of his great works out with this quote. All unhealthy diets are the same. Each unhealthy diet is unhealthy. Each healthy diet is healthy in its own way. And what I mean by this is that if you look at the average unhealthy diet, you can sum it up with a handful of problems. They're eating a whole bunch of sugar, a whole bunch of vegetable oil, a lot of refined grains, and everything is doused in additives, preservatives, and chemical toxins. Whereas if you look at healthy diets, if you look throughout history, and you look at the literally hundreds of different varieties of plants that we've eaten, and you look at all of the different animal product that we've eaten, and all of the thousands of different ways we've prepared these foods and combined these foods, there are many different ways to eat a healthy diet. For 6 million years, people have lived to an old age, and they've been healthy, and they've been vibrant and strong, and we can too if we're just a little more aware of our food choices. And so I hope that this presentation has made you a little more aware. Thank you. So it looks like we might have time to take a couple questions, and this other group is supposed to come in at 7:30, but if anybody does have questions, I'd love to take them. Yes, Karen?
Do you have a website or a blog?
Karen, that's a great question, especially since you've pressured me to get one for so long. and I don't, and I wish I did. Yeah, I still...
But
Yeah,
it's
I
a
still-
requirement of his graduation next semester.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Yeah, by next semester I will have a...
Follow my example.
They've been doing it for years, Ken.
Yeah, we'll have a website up next semester, and hopefully I'll be able to give another presentation next semester, and I'll be able to pass out some business cards and some links. Yeah, Brandon.
How was sugar processed before the Industrial Revolution? I don't know.
We did have the sugarcane production, where
Okay.
they just mash it down and then they strain it, and a lot of that sugar wasn't as refined as we get it nowadays.
Yeah.
It was still more of brown sugar.
Interesting.
Well, like I said, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it, and I hope you had a good time.
Thank you.